Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. Today I had an altercation with some fellow leftists over prison abolition. Not because we even disagreed. While I am a prison skeptic, I think prisons tend to breed crime. And my reasons for that are talking about it are personal and also familial. I have dealt with prisons on both ends, both in the prisoner end and the prison guard end, and subsidiary staff. The U.S. murder rate on average is higher than most other OECD countries, but still lower than a lot of the world. So murder rates by country and world population, and these are deceptive because there are places and say you think Mexico is dangerous. Well, there are places in Mexico that have lower murder rates than the U.S. on average. And there are places in the United States that have higher murder rates than El Salvador. They're usually not, however, big cities. They're usually mid-sized cities, as we talked about before. The U.S. murder rate is, unfortunately, in the interim of, say, world murder rates. It's kind of in the lower middle. And I talk about this because there has been a significant uptick in crime here in the United States in a very real and measurable way. But it's something we should be worried about. But it's not what a lot of people portray it as either. So in the United States, the aggregate murder rate is 6.5 per 100,000. That's a lot. You look at some place like, I don't know, Denmark, and it is significantly lower. Canada as well. And they vary by states. For example, Louisiana has almost 20 per 100,000. Mississippi has 20 per 100,000. Alabama has 14 per 100,000. California, as bad as it seems, and as while there's been a big uptick in crime in places like Oakland, unless you're in Stockton or one of the more busted out industrial zones, the murder rate is still less than 6 per 100,000. The U.S. incarceration rate, however, is 500 per 100,000. That means roughly, when you do the math, that over 10% of the population has some relationship with the prison system. I know it touches my life, both in my students and in my family. And because of my family's privacy, I don't go into it. But I'm aware of the conditions. I'm aware of the way that it racializes. It accelerates racialization. In fact, prisons are even organized in such a way that encourage it, and I know it's from experience. Why do you think the Aryan Nation's primary recruiting and breeding ground is prisons? Now, I could go into the anthropological research why I think this is true, why people use race as a proxy for kinship when all other proxies for symbolic kinship fail, why this leads to ad hoc and duress communities of highly competitive men and women, mostly men though. I could go into that for you. I know the stats. I could also talk about how prison planning is based off of literacy rates, and literacy rates are declining. So guess what's likely to start building soon? And the US goes through cycles of massive incarceration, then lenience, but lenience that doesn't fix any of the social problems that led to the outburst in crime in the first place. Now, I do not think all human violence is because of social inequity or something like that. I am not a utopian in that way. Even places with relatively low social inequity have crime, but they have much less of it per capita. Now, when I talk about crime stats and prison abolition, I've actually had people yell at me from both sides. One, a lot of people think that prison abolition under current conditions would make things worse, and I happen to actually agree with them. If you do not fix a bunch of other comorbid things, if you just were to open the gates of the prison, it would be a nightmare land. You have to deal with complex social problems complexly. And no, it is not just a matter of having more housing or more food or just giving people homes, although that would greatly help. Educational norms have to reestablish. People have to be reintegrated into communities, given meaningful community responsibilities and work. And one of the things that we do is in the United States, we increase social stigma around this to the point that your sentence for being in prison and being a felon is not just disenfranchisement and the actual time served, but it is also generally that most jobs become unavailable to you. I have family members who I can talk to you about this for, and they end up being jobs that maybe some of them are actually somewhat lucrative, but they're usually also rife with other social ills, such as addiction and whatnot. Now, I can tell you that in developed communities where people are safe and cared for, things like addiction are not as big of a problem as they are without it. The problems of alienation accelerate this. But this is just one in a long stream of problems where there are neat sloganeered solutions and then people responding to the idiocy of those sloganeered solutions, but no dealing with a counter program or countervalence or any complex analysis of what we need to do outside of liberal institutions and NGO activists. Nobody who looks at the stats of America, compares us to any other country, can answer that we are a functional society with this much of society behind bars. We are literally 25% of all the world's incarcerated people. We are not 25% of the world's population. But we also cannot deny that crime affects poor communities more than even middle class and rich ones, although there is crime in all of them. Yes, a whole lot of what we classify as crime is not really socially harmful, but there's plenty of stuff that is. And schemas for police abolition that involve large scales of immediate social work have to deal with the fact that we don't have the labor force for the social work conditions we have now. Nor do we support them, nor have social work been really truly removed from the carceral state. Now, they're not cops in the way that they can't just shoot you, but they are part of the prison complex. I'm a teacher. We have a role in this too. I am not a fool. But I want to tell you something more cynical, more than just this immediate problem. You see, no political valiance in our current society that is largely motivated solely off negative partisanship can do anything about this, because negative partisanship can only be sustained by crisis. Crisis everywhere. We see it in the schools. For a long time, there was a denial by liberals and leftists of a crisis in the schools, or the crisis was testing itself. In 2015, there was a study where 8th graders started losing ground on literacy, and it was across the board in every racial category and in most demographic categories, economic demographic categories. And we've seen that while A's have gone up in prestigious schools, most of whom seem to focus primarily on things like sports, that remediation has gone up dramatically even for those students, meaning that the grades don't mean anything. That's another social institution failing. We've seen our healthcare system crack. Now, the irony of the United States is this: North America is more energy secure and more food secure than most of the other regional continental blocks. But the United States' internal social problems are so large that it looks like that does not mitigate against decline. And thus, the silent Caesar of the military holds so much of this together as everything else jumps from crisis to crisis to justify its own obstruction. Almost no political vision you are offered, from the conservative one to the liberal one, offers you a cohesive community answer. And if you don't have a community answer, you also don't have a class answer, and you don't have a political subject. You have no first principles to base those political subjects around except for opposition to other groups. And conservatives, this is even more true of you than leftists. We have a sclerotic elite, a quote PMC, that is divided against itself and splitting. People have only noticed it now that it is splitting apart. And in its splitting, it has radicalized in some areas. But as time progresses and nothing has come of that radicalization, we've seen normalization, which I predicted, by the way, that the popularity of socialism would decline. I didn't actually see the popularity of capitalism declining too, with a vague third thing not mentioned on the horizon, and yet that is what we have. And even right-wing counter-systemic groups, such as Meloni in Italy, largely are only allowed to make radical social policy on the margins, such as opposing surrogacy or, maybe some home policy that her party is pushing. But in general, they play along with the elite institutions because they need them. See, the thing about massive deskilling and PMCs is if they control all the information, you still need them. And it's not lost on me that even the most anarchist people I know, but all the social democrats, even lots of the MLs who complain about the PMC, are themselves from that social strata. It is a shock of self-recognition, but one that is rooted in nostalgia and has no way to actually undo the current trends within it. I've been focusing more on principles, both in my shows with Sean KB and Antafara, and in my discussions here on the history of sociology, on how we should relate, why we should think about things like psychoanalysis and its categories applied socially, not just rehashing the DSM, why we should think logically. But I know I'm pushing against a cultural tide. See, everything seems so unfixable because, one, there are only 3 real places for people to go. Academia, which is increasingly a slog. Everyone I know who's getting PhDs, even in the sciences, hates it. It no longer provides a secure way of life. You're likely to be in what was traditionally a transitional job, adjuncting, for a while after 6 years of being a TA, which a TA is probably more representative and slightly more lucrative. While there's administrative bloat everywhere, we're also discovering those jobs aren't as bullshit as people thought, because as we remove them under crisis, things don't work as well. We don't actually understand the complexity of our own institutions. until you deal with this complexity, until you treat it as a real variable, until you look at this and start to generate a positive social vision that deals with simplifying, reducing hierarchies, not just because hierarchies are inherently good or bad. That's not even why I say you need to reduce them. Now, I have a moral position towards a classless society, which I will admit is a moral position. And I define classless probably less strictly than a lot of anarchists, but probably more strictly than many Marxists today who've given up on a lot of what Marx himself said. Or even Lenin. For all the people who posited that Lenin thought of a neutral state, they need to go back and read State and Revolution, where Lenin agrees with Anton Pannekoek on the nature of the state. And if there is a standing army which can be supplied off surplus, you have a class society. But without the standing army, we literally can't imagine how the current trade system is maintainable. Many people who are anti-imperialists for good moral reasons cannot articulate what an alternative vision would be, because even the states they support are still somewhat dependent on this current system and have not come up with a way to buoy themselves out of it, even though many had plans that have been scuttled by the accelerations post-COVID. What does it take to build a group of people who understand these problems, who have the discipline to build themselves up, who do not encourage people to be victims, who do not encourage facile cynicism? Yes, I am cynical about institutions that currently exist, and I think you are absolutely right to do so. But if you are cynical about any attempt to replace them, then you might as well just be for the institutions. So much of the left has offered nothing but bullshit to you. But the left is not unique in this. Conspiracy theories, no way to stem the megachurch trend. You know, megachurches are actually a sign of secularization. They're a sign of the concentration of power, that individual churches cannot support themselves anymore. And community churches do not have enough community links to be supported by those communities, except in places where there are strong counterincentive historical trends, like in Utah, where I live, where there are still, by ward decree, small church wards. But every place that can consolidate and centralize it, that has. And then in centralization, you have cascade failure, and thus further secularization. Even the religious are more secular. They cannot come up with a morality outside that of the political morality of the parties they belong. In some ways, yes, it is always true that in some degree, religious institutions were masked for power. But there's also, even in our historical memory, where religious institutions were strong enough to propose a counterpower to society at large. That is not the case anymore. That is why everything seems unfixable. The neutral administrative state was actually co-emergent with both Fordism and early neoliberalism. Both have been in crisis since the turn of the last century. The entire American compact of America's real rise to power relative to everyone else was very brief. And that is mostly during the Fordist period. And it was America's own actions to expand its market, which led Germany and Japan to be real competitors for trade. Now, that undid the need for a Bretton Woods agreement. Didn't undo the need for a transatlantic superstate, though, which has remained in its lean. And people who have nostalgia, who want the 50s back, have to deal with the fact that those conditions do not exist anymore. And they were sui generis and unique even then. Everyone's looking at demographic decline. Some of which on scales we haven't seen before, but it is absolutely true that every developed nation is experiencing it. The idea that one country is going to crack under that and others aren't just seems laughable to me. There's a bunch of strains on national identities and nations and governments and institutions coming, even if nothing gets worse. And that's assuming that climate change is not actually going to accelerate all this. And in lieu of that, people can only motivate people from crisis. When has someone tried to give you an anti-racism that actually had a vision of a post-racial society? There isn't one on the table, nor is there even one for racial nationalism or coexistence separatism or any of that. None of that is on the table. You're served up things that even the people who study it don't really believe in, such as implicit bias tests, which do nothing about systemic wealth gaps. Our focus on wealth in aggregate, it doesn't deal with the fact that wealth inequalities go greater the further up you go in family held wealth, and that even most white people don't have access to that. All these things are used by people who are well-meaning but distort you. And even academia standards has declined with a decline in any belief in objectivity. Now, yes, objectivity was always a myth, and it was used in ways that instantiated a certain view of power. Absolutely true. But you've replaced it with nothing, with no attempt to see past your own biases. Just a celebration of everyone's unique biases blended into a cornucopia. See how that's working out for you. People who complain that the left can't generate virtues or things it wants to do or just make decisions also can't deal with the fact that it also can't generate elites or counter elites to do it. Even MMT requires a massive bureaucratic apparatus to do correctly, to make, and by correctly I mean to implement any of its positive programs, job guarantees, taxation to reduce power, equalization of wealth. None of that can be done easily without risk of inflation, and very specific investment, meaning you need state planners. As an out for the planned economy, it isn't one. Did you not notice? All the answers you get from the left are equally technocratic. Of course, people don't trust them. And they're right not to. Everything seems so unfixable because our political institutions are now largely based on economic forms that are rent-seeking and surplus-sucking, but are still based on producing commodities somewhere at the base, which is why you don't see this in countries that aren't highly industrially productive. Almost all systemic ways of viewing this have you bracket out something that's inconvenient so you can come to a simple answer. There is no simple answer. Defunding the police was a simple answer, one that if you think about the logic of institutions never made sense. Particularly if the chiefs were allowed to control the administration of their remaining funds and kept all their weapons and current personnel. Furthermore, attempts to progressivize the police have largely, which were big in the prior decade, had largely failed. And everything goes on unabated. In addition, crime gets worse. Now, yes, Virginia, crime is much worse in other places, as I pointed out. The U.S. aggregate crime rate is not as bad as either anyone portrays. It's just bad compared to the super rich countries. Even compare it to the UK, it doesn't look quite as bad as it used to. However, things are getting worse in general. And it's not just the United States that is experiencing the social decline, but as the hegemon of the current world system, it makes sense that it would show the most here. There's no citations today. This is just a rant. But think about it. Fordism and neoliberalism emerged with the decline of civic republicanism. And I can even tell you how this changed our electoral apparatus. Most people don't realize that our electoral apparatus in America changed dramatically very recently, and in small ways, to shut out outsiders and to both make it seem more democratic, but remove institutional power from other groups, such as NGOs, what would become MGOs, labor, and leave it largely up to media and those who could afford enough media. Now, it's not like the smoke-filled rooms were not oligarchical. They were just differently oligarchical. But that also concurs with the economic planning and organization of the time. Yes, it's all been capitalism since like 1700, but each crisis and major recession cycle in capitalism changes the way it is administered. And if you don't see that and understand that, or you don't understand that it's primarily about administration, then you will think that capitalism has resolved its internal contradictions, or we just need to get better people in institutions, or we just need to print more money. Even MMTers don't really think the latter, despite the fact they are portrayed as such. There is no simple answer. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters. We now have 400 of you. I really appreciate you. I don't understand why my Patreon is so large in comparison to my YouTube presence, which is tiny, and my podcast presence, which is still in the top 25%, but, you know, not huge. No Joe Rogan cast here, nor do I want to be. But I have a decent sized Patreon, and I'd like to thank you for that. Have a great day.